Hello class, I'm Instructor Hollon, and this lecture is on the theory of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a very popular theory today, and it's a consequentialist theory in ethics. That means it focuses on the consequences of actions. Uh, think of the task weighing the consequences. According to utilitarianism, the ethical status of our actions is based on their consequences, and these can be weighed or measured. The good, then, the quote unquote, the good is found in the most pleasurable or beneficial consequences. The idea is for the majority of people, then, not just for the few. So the bad will be uh, the greatest pain or suffering for the majority of people. Or think of it as actions that bring about pain and suffering. If the quantity produced is greater than otherwise, then it will be bad, and vice versa for the good. If the quantity of good, pleasure, or happiness produced is greater than otherwise, it will be good. So these are the key ideas behind the theory of utilitarianism. For a general overview, see the Abomir reading on utilitarianism in Matthews 2020, pages 45 to 51. So let's look at a little historical background to the theory. There are two significant philosophers in the history of ethics who uh, are famous utilitarians. The first one is Jeremy Bentham, who lived 1748 to 1832. For his reading, see Happiness is the Greatest Good in the Archie and Archie Reader, 2004, pages 292 to 306. And of course, John Stuart Mill from 1806 to 1873. For his reading, see Utilitarianism in Levin, 2019, pages 130 to 136. So these are little snippets. And the basic idea, the way that utilitarians go about applying the theory is with an eye to what they call the principle of utility. This basic principle of the theory, the basic principle of the theory of utilitarianism then is called the principle of utility. This principle says that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Citing Mill and Levin 2019, page 130. The basic idea is that the ends justify the means. That's the commonest catchphrase that you might hear associated with this theory. This theory is similar to egoism in that it focuses on pleasure and happiness and seeks to maximize pleasure and happiness. But it is different from egoism in that it focuses on the greatest amount of happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people and not merely the individual. So that's where there is a key difference between egoism and utilitarianism. When faced with a moral decision, the utilitarian weighs the consequences of different alternatives, the consequences for everybody, before selecting the action that produces the greatest benefit. So pleasure and happiness play an important role here. The ancient precursor to the theory of utilitarianism is hedonism and Epicureanism, and these also lay behind ethical egoism. In these ancient systems, pleasure plays an important role, and utilitarianism identifies happiness with pleasure. See Levin 2019, page 124. It also introduces the distinction between instrumental and intrinsic goods. Whereas education and music, for example, may bring about happiness, these are instrumental goods. Happiness and pleasure themselves are intrinsic goods. So things are instrumental. Goods are instrumental in bringing about the greater good, which will be, again, grounded in happiness. Things, as far as they bring about pain and suffering, will bring our bad goods, things that bring about bad consequences. So let's look at a key idea that was important for Bentham: calculating the greatest happiness, the greatest amount of happiness. Bentham proposed using a calculus he called the utilitarian calculus to judge the greatest happiness. For more details on this, on the utilitarian calculus, see Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, pages 13 to 15, and Archie, 2004, pages 292 to 302. We are to think of each instance of pain and pleasure as a unit on this view, the way you might count money using pennies, right? Thus, when we consider moral questions, we add up the amount of projected pain and pleasure by thinking of time and individuals involved. And Bentham has 7 principles, criteria, that he uses to render a utilitarian judgment, to do his utilitarian calculus. The first one focuses on intensity. This assigns values to the different degrees of pain and pleasure, whether they are mild or severe. This makes sense. So if someone is in more pain than another person, that naturally that person would deserve more attention, immediate attention. So so intensity helps to accommodate that intuition. Duration, the second one, duration. Consider the duration of the experiences of pain or pleasure. Okay, so how much time will you experience pain or pleasure? If the experience is longer than someone else, well, then it will be greater. Could be greater, and that will relate to intensity. But if all things are equal, then duration will trump. Greater duration will require attention versus a shorter duration. Certainty, principle of remoteness. How far in the future is the pleasure? How long do you have to wait until you experience the effect? Or how long do you have to wait to avoid the unwanted consequence? Fecundity. This means to figure out the probabilities that certain actions will produce pain or pleasure before deciding on the single course of action. Okay. So thinking about how likely the consequences are. Purity. Determine if any pain will be felt alongside that pleasure. This kind of follows along with fecundity. If you're imagining the outcomes of an action when you're making your utilitarian judgment using the calculus, you think, how likely is this action to bring about an effect? Will that effect have any pain or pleasure? This in turn will determine your judgment about the course of action. The 7th principle then is extent. This determines how many people might be able to share in the pleasure or the pain. So with those 7 principles, criteria, Bentham suggested we could render utilitarian judgments based on quantifying the amount of projected pain or pleasure for any action. And that's how we can determine which actions are right or wrong depending on their effects. Now there's some problems with this theory that Mill wanted to look at. And this raises the question of quantity versus quality of pleasure. We'll look more at the problems next week, so I simply note this here in the lecture and point your attention forward to next week as we revisit problems, specifically problems with utilitarianism. Suffice it to say now, in light of some problems that Bentham's theory had raised. Mill made some adjustments to the theory, if you will. So Bentham's version of utilitarianism says that only the quantity of pleasure factors in our moral judgments. But Mill's version says that both quantity and quality play a role. So see Mill on Liberty and Utilitarianism, books 1 and 2 and books 3 through 4. On Mill's view, intellectual pleasures are more qualitative than purely sensual ones. So Mill grades intellectual pleasure with sensual pleasure. And so then by gradation or by degree of quality, intellectual pleasure will be given greater weight in the scheme of weighing, again, a calculus judgment there, versus sensual pleasures. And this brings us to the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism then. Accordingly, there are two different versions of utilitarianism: Bentham's act and Mill's rule utilitarianism. Since the theory looks like it can be used to justify any action so long as its consequences are beneficial, it looks like it can be used to justify lying, cheating, stealing, etc. So the reasoning is that in light of some perceived problems with act utilitarianism, again, Bentham's theory, Mill's version apparently helps deal with some of the problems, and we end up classifying this theory as rule utilitarianism. So theorists have developed the rule version in order to counter the problem. Well, let's look at the definitions. For act utilitarianism, the formal definition will be: an action is moral if and only if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. An action is moral if and only if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The formal definition for rule utilitarianism is: an action is good if and only if it is done in accordance with a rule that is intended to and brings about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. An action is good if and only if it is done in accordance with a rule that is intended to and brings about the greatest good for the greatest number of people, or think of it as the greatest happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people. Thus, while lying in an individual instance may bring about greater happiness for the liar and justified by act utilitarianism, it ends up looking suspiciously like ethical egoism here. The act of lying may be denounced as immoral by the rule utilitarian, since it would tend to bring about more negative consequences if people began lying to each other with impunity, without fear of punishment. For more discussion on rule utilitarianism and this concern and this strength of the theory, see Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, page 22. Now, I mentioned those developments just to help lay out the historical developments of the theory, but we'll look at criticisms of the theory in more detail next week. So let's look at proof of the theory. All right, the theory is an empirical theory and must draw from experience to find support. Mill says that the proof of the theory is that all people desire happiness, and it is alone desired for its own sake. So we value happiness or pleasure for its own sake, and that's how we can tell utilitarianism is true. Theorists have questioned both contentions, though. It's not clear that what is desired is always good, and it is equally not clear that happiness is the only thing that is desired for its own sake. And this will bring us to the objections that we'll look at again next week. So for this week's lecture, I want to close with a comment on non-hedonistic utilitarianist views. Modern versions of utilitarianism have been developed as well, and some of these ground the greatest good apart from pleasure or hedonism. For example, according to Singer's theory, Peter Singer, the greatest good is found in our ability to see our preferences through, because this usually makes for a better life. All right, for more discussion, see Dimmock and Fisher 2017, pages 24 to 25. So I mentioned that in closing for this lecture as a way that modern utilitarians can try to deal with some of the objections that were raised historically, but we'll look at these again in more detail next week and see where we end up for current discussion. I've also included some multimedia and lecture videos in the course module and links with more information on utilitarianism and the history of utilitarianism. So if you would like to pursue more information on the theory, in addition to the assigned zero textbook material, you can use some of the multimedia that I make available this week. And if you have any questions on anything we covered on utilitarianism, Act or Rule Utilitarianism, please feel free to send me an email or to stop by office hours and we can talk about any of the questions. All right. Until next time, thank you for joining me.